Bueno, mientras siguen llegando algunos que están rezagados en las otras mesas, vamos a dar inicio a la última parte de esta jornada con un invitado internacional dedicado al desarrollo de capacidades de innovación en el sector público. Fue director ejecutivo de Alianzas Globales de Innovación en Nesta, la Fundación de Innovación del Reino Unido, y fundador y primer director ejecutivo del Centro Australiano de Innovación Social. Hoy es cofundador y líder de States of Change, una red global que ayuda a los gobiernos a construir la próxima generación de innovación pública. A lo largo de su carrera ha acompañado a gobiernos y equipos públicos de distintos países, incluido Chile, en el fortalecimiento de sus capacidades para innovar. Damos la bienvenida a Brenton Caffin y los invitamos a escuchar su charla.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel today, to the Congress. This is the third time I'm in Santiago, and I would like to talk to you today about the role of public innovation, particularly as a tool of undertaking different, sailing through different types of crises. Once upon a time, I had some hair, and I wanted to show you how my journey has been, how it started when I graduated from the Department of Ministers in Australia, Canberra. I don't want to tell you the age I had then, but this is when I started out. We had a constitutional convention with regards as to whether you had to change the constitution. I understand you've had experiences similar of nature. In Australia, had the unique reputation of having the worst success in referendums. We had 45 referendums, only 8 times. So it had to do if we had to become a republic or not. Spoiler alert, we voted no. So we've learned from the beginning. This is 2 weeks after graduating, and I realized how difficult it was to provide a case for change. And in the way of the route of innovation, starting in 2009, I created an institution called Taxi for Innovation for Social Lives. We used innovations to take charge of social innovations and to use design methodologies, which many of you are using, and I've seen the posters outside. I understand that's everywhere, and it's fantastic. But 2009, we did use that in very effective way in Australia, but we wanted to see what innovation could do to be able to take charge or make charge of these challenges. The first project that we saw in the area of protection for children, and the questions I made from my colleagues back then is what part of the system has a greater crisis, and after a century of innovation, could we have some kind of change? Or what we want to do is just to be accused of doing things which too nice to have. We want to take charge of the big problems, and on seeing the way how we could avoid families to give away their children, and in that way. So the project that we carried out, it was called Family by Family. That was the name of the project. Basically, we got to know families that had problems and who had found a solution, and we got together with families that still had problems, and after 12 weeks we got together and we reviewed where they were, and in those 2 weeks we had a role model and accompanying them with a family that worked, both talking about fathers and children who were mentors of other families, and they were designing this program together. It wasn't people from the designs who were the facilitators, and the families helped us, how to do this, and others helped us to execute it. And it's 16 years now since it started. At the beginning of the year, we published a longitudinal study, which is a follow-up of the families for 6 years, for more than 2,000 families, 4,000 children, and they realized that the risk was significantly reduced, that children to avoid finishing in state care. 40% also reduced the amount of people who were going to go to emergency services. So that represents quite a big significant saving for the state. More significantly is important change for the better for these families, that they were not separated and go to different services, family services and care services. That was my exploration in the social innovation, public innovation sphere. I enjoyed it a lot. And this is, and after that, I went to live to England working with Nesta, basically an organization which promotes innovation for society, British society in the 90s, established in the 90s. I was 6 years and a half, and I was never in a group photo, always in somewhere else. And at that moment, this was a fascinating place, a research place, a program design place, capacity building, and everywhere that had an impact. We all got together, which gave us an opportunity to see all the aspects, different aspects of innovation, and how they could be made visible to make better functioning society. So a very active place, the very places in innovations, and this brief, this is quite active here, a little bit. There was some activities in machine learning 2015 back then in Nesta. So basically we had all the different ways of undertaking innovation with different methods, approaches, which helped us understand reality, which helped us design how to use this technology, how to train the space, and how to better train people during a positive process. How to teach it also. My team, the team of innovation, proposed to simplify these without losing these stories. And one of the ways which is done to design these things here, which are the 6 perspectives or principles, and these was ways in which to unblock any complex problems and focuses from different angles. These are methodologies that compete, they complement amongst themselves, the different ways of seeing the problems from different angles. We can see this as a kind of compass, which having 3 axes. The axis of people, systems, understand how people experience their lives, and then to take a step back and understand how systems work and how you can have intersections through these systems. On seeing the facts and data evidence, all have said that how to project data from the past and also to consider the future using methods which are forecasting and tools to predict the future, possible futures, and access to solutions, how to frame these problems. Sometimes the choice that we make of framing the problem limits us how we think. We were talking in the morning, the words that we use have encompass the solutions, or so how families we shouldn't see families that are which up to, but we saw resources in the family who could help other families, and these unblocked that resource on looking at it this way. So at the end, the solution is how to develop and assess our ideas, how we reduce risk, how do we experience this with the systems before going to the policymakers. We also think about the different methods and how they can appear in the continuum of experimentation. There were a talk in the morning. They're mentioning their tools how to encompass this. That we don't know how to see what we don't know. Some are speculative, some are prognosis. I am economist, so I diverge. So different methods to see all these aspects, visualize them, and continuing advancing, we can develop evaluations and refine ideas. And then at the end, when we're trying to manage risk, if we're going to send a vaccine to everybody, we want to have rigorous tests before that. And so we had a lot of debates on this, on different experimental focus, people who love tests with controls, random controls, other teams that like these types of designs, and they work down waters on first on what is the type of problem. Not that they're mistaken, but each one has a specific place in the process. What then took me to the state of change, which was mentioned, states of change. We talked about this 2017 as an answer to a feeling that we had back then that schools, government, public policies are not fully equipping the public servants with the tools that we mentioned. They weren't teaching the next generation of innovators. And who we've worked in these innovation teams, we've been building these capacities, but not too much. Basically, we wanted to make our economy, wanted to call the school or public administrations, but because of brand names, we had to change to states of change. And last years, we've trained teams throughout the world. We were here with laboratory government in 15, on its restoration in Argentina too. We've done some courses throughout the world during these times, building and working together with a general group which have had experiences in these fields. And what is it that we teach? We were thinking a lot in the abilities and attitudes that we should have for when carrying out this work. We interview very many colleagues. This is a meeting that we had in London 2015. We can say that we had some friends from Brazil, Colombia, somebody know Nicolas here in the Singapore, and all these innovation teams. And you can say, what ability do you use in your teams and how do you see that? We did a lot of brainstorming, and at the end we had a general framework which is available in our webpage, Creative Commons. You can use that. You can disseminate change. Please tell us what you do with it. This is done applied by governments throughout the world. I would like to have more detail on this. I don't know how much, but there's a link at the end which you can download the presentation. But basically, we could see that there were three clusters, ability clusters, very important, where teams had to experiment on and solve public experiments, and they had to have some of these sites in order to have some progress. The first cluster is focusing is the purpose of these abilities is to accelerate our learning. And I want to remember that phrase because I'm going to tell you at the end, when we go for uncertainty periods and change, crises, what helps us to go through this crisis is the speed of our learning, not how much quickly we can move, but how quickly we can learn. For example, things like be capable to connect ourselves with long-term visions and long-term skills, to be able to make prototype and iterating our ideas, learn how to use data, and based on systems to be familiarized with the potential without being an expert in technology. All these are ways that help us to build ideas and test ideas, and these are basically the classic ideas that are in an innovation team, but they're not sufficient. The second cluster has to do how we could collaborate, work together with efforts. We've seen lots of different teams this morning. It has to do how we can collaborate with the agents, sectors, citizens, how we do within inter-regions, and there is always a way, one part that affects the collaboration. How can we design processes to take the people from one way that they be valued, listened, that they listen to each other, able to commit their time, their energy, and be able to do things, be executable, how they can build bridges, how they can find common ideas, common purposes in different groups, such that we different ways. How once you get there, how could you do that the person remains there?
So collaboration isn't about everyone getting what they want. It's about how do you walk people through a process so they can understand that their voices have been heard and have been effectively built into the ideas you're coming up with. And then the third set of skills that we thought were really, really important for innovation teams to try and actually make change happen were these cluster around leading change. Because if all innovation needed was the good ideas, we'd have them already. And innovation is hard work, all right? You not only have to have the good idea, you not only have to take people with you on a journey, you also need to make sure that you leverage, or at least don't get squashed, by politics or bureaucracy. We talked about, Vaughan's giving you some great strategies for how you can sort of, navigate that and stay under the radar. Sometimes there's value in going above the radar, but it's further down the track. How you get the money to do this work, right? How do you finance change? How do you be insurgent of the entrepreneurship? How do you find the resources to get the thing done? Sometimes people describe this as hustle. I'm not sure if that translates into Spanish. But importantly, these last two, how do you demonstrate the value of what you're doing? Why should people care? And how you demonstrate that value will be different to different audiences. Some people will want to hear life stories. Some people want to hear about the dollars and cents. And, neither are wrong or right. They're both necessary. How are you demonstrating the value of what you're doing at each stage of your solution development process? Which links to storytelling and advocacy. How are you getting people to care? How are you telling a story that helps them to relate to what you're actually doing? So these are these three big clusters that I'd encourage you to think about. Maybe just before I hit the next slide, just pause for a minute and think about the teams you're currently working in and thinking, okay, where does that feel really good? And where might we need a little bit more work? But this is sensitive, isn't it? There we go. When we did this work, we actually started out just thinking about skills, but the more we kind of dug into this, the more we realized there was another sort of subset of characteristics about the people that work in these teams that weren't really skill-based, but were super, super important for creating the kind of change that we want to see. And these were sort of what we described as the attitudes. So these aren't necessarily easily taught. They're often the things that you have innately in yourself, and they're in tension with one another. So some of these are very, very sort of introverted, sort of being reflective or imaginative or empathetic. Sometimes it's just being very kind of patient and thoughtful. And some of these are very action-oriented. In fact, one of them is action-oriented, agile, resilient, outcomes-focused, courageous. It's a yin-yang thing. So sometimes you need to stop being busy to ask yourself the questions, are we doing the right thing? Is there a better way of doing it? And sometimes you need to just do it. And you need to stop thinking and stop the analysis paralysis and do the next thing. And what's really important is you need all of this. Now, one person probably doesn't do all of these equally well. So actually thinking about your team, how is your team balance? Again, think about your current team that you're working in. Are you all too imaginative and empathetic, or are you all too action-oriented and outcomes-focused? Because that might determine what other sort of people you might want to bring into your teams. So we used to use this a lot with innovation teams to help them understand what skill sets they actually had and to work out what their sort of learning and development program might want to look like. So this is the team at LabX in Portugal, going through and understanding what their strengths were. Again, there's a really good exercise you can do on this. It's on the website. But effectively, we mapped out using dots what people saw as their strengths. Their teams confirmed it. The black ones were their superpowers. And then we also did the same for their attitudes. And very quickly, you can kind of see where the center of gravity is in the team. This actually looks like a reasonably balanced team by the looks of it. They need more help on finance. But this helps you decide, do we need more training? Do we need to recruit different people? Do we need to partner with different organizations in different ways to help balance out what we're trying to achieve? So as I say, there's a website. You can actually do this exercise for yourself. There'll be another URL at the end. You can take that then. But you can actually go through and do this test for yourself. You can do this with your team, and you can share the results. Sorry. Hang on. There you go. This is great. Okay. All right. So Cristobal also asked me to talk a little bit about how you do all of this into the centre of government. I've spent a few minutes talking about that. 5 years ago, I went back into government. A few things had changed. Some things hadn't. So I went into the Premier's department. So this is at the state level, so not the national government, but the state government of South Australia. And I was the Executive Director of Strategy and Policy. And I was very excited for the first time in 10, 12 years, my title didn't have any innovation in it. And I was determined that I was going to smuggle innovation in without anyone noticing. I tried to build a strategy and policy team that reflected everything you've just seen in the previous slides. So this was actually a slide deck that we presented to the Premier. He got elected 6 months after I joined the department. We had a change of government. I was waiting for him to joke about what's the value of strategic foresight, to which I could have said, I got here 6 months before you did. Okay, just waiting to see if there's the translation time lag. Anyway, this government came in with a mantra. Their political slogan was policies not just for the next 4 years, but for the next generation. I got very excited because this was exactly my jam, and we'd built a team to do exactly that. So what we said is, our job is to actually help government to anticipate future change, to govern adaptively, not just do 5-year plans, but actually stay on the balls of our feet and keep iterating, to maximize opportunities for in the face of exponential change. So not just see uncertainty as a risk, but also see it as an opportunity. And actually, how does a small state be well prepared to take opportunities and move quickly to take advantage of them? And to do this so that South Australians can live dignified, prosperous, healthy and happy lives. And we did this by bringing together this integration of foresight, technology strategy, system design innovation, economic financial analysis, and policy experimentation. So for those of you who like org charts, I refuse to do an org chart. I did a Venn diagram. And part of what we were trying to do was to educate our political leaders that this was a different capability set that they could draw upon. We weren't just going to do boring sort of policy reports. We were a team that you could give us really important strategic challenges that were keeping you up late at night, and we could help you think about how we might respond to those. So those were the 4 areas that we built capabilities within our team to do. This is our Premier. Peter Malinauskas is his name. For those of you who follow The Rest is Politics podcast, he was the International Politician of the Year last year on that podcast. He's banned social media for under 16-year-olds. He's banned political donations. He's done a whole bunch of things. We basically worked with him to develop our long-term economic strategy for the state. That's him waving it around. That's what we call in the policy game the money shot. Because once he's waved it around, it exists. You can't, that's on the internet forever. And we can now have conversations with our colleagues about how do we implement this. But what we did was, this wasn't a dry document. This document was an artifact that helped us implement this thinking. So we actually looked at what are all the global trends affecting our future. And we named the big shifts. You'll recognize some of these. We were talking about, geopolitical shifts before, not before Ukraine, but before Gaza, before the Strait of Hormuz. We were mainly worried about the South China Sea, but decarbonisation, artificial intelligence, and so on. And we said, if this is the context we're operating in, where do we show up as a state? That might be hard to read at the back, but the idea was we actually named our values. We wanted an economy that was smart, sustainable, and inclusive. We identified 3 missions where we thought South Australia had the best place to show up, which was around capitalising on the green transition. South Australia went from 1% to 75% renewable energy in 15 years. So we were very well placed to be part of that. Being a partner of choice in an insecure world, we build submarines and we have a big defence establishment. How do we get ready for a world that's going to become more insecure? And importantly, how do we have a conversation about our people? Because you can't do any of this unless you've got a strategy for attracting the right people to a small state when you can't bribe them with lots of money because we're a small state. So that was the overarching strategy, but I think what was really interesting is what happened in the sort of 2 years that followed was, without having to tell anyone how to do their job, we actually started to build policy coherence. And all of the other agencies got on and did their own work. So we've got infrastructure strategy and transport and minerals and small business and the planning strategy for Greater Adelaide. And they're all informed by this overarching vision. But we didn't tell them how to do their job. This was an exercise in what we called sort of policy coherence and alignment. So how do we actually articulate a story that is future-proofed, but also has enough scope for people to actually interpret what it means for them in the context that they're operating in? So very briefly, what worked in government, anticipating, not reacting, so actually really leaning into those global megatrends and building shared scenarios that actually ensured that policymakers were all using a shared set of assumptions about what we thought was going to happen in the state. We built these missions. I once said to the Premier, this is not a shopping list for Christmas. This is the context you're going to operate in for the next 20 years. So it helps to sustain that direction over time, and particularly when people get busy with crises, it helps to kind of maintain that overall direction. And then finally, we were clear on the what, but we were very flexible on the how, which let government agencies work out what it meant for them. Okay, so in the last 13 minutes, I want to give you some thoughts about where we're going with public innovation as somebody who's been around this area for a little while. I've mentioned this to a few people today in breaks and stuff, this word polycrisis. Can I give a quick show of hands who's heard this term before? Vaughan has. And about 2 or 3 others. Okay, so it hasn't made the jump from English to Spanish. So the next slide hopefully can translate it for you. Hands up who's seen this meme. That's still not that many. Okay, a few more. All right. So the polycrisis is really all about cascading risks and crises facing our world. You can't read this, but this is from the World Economic Forum. Every year they publish a list of the 5 biggest global risks facing us. And it's basically, this is the list for the last 15 years. Interestingly, in 2020, the year of the pandemic, didn't pick it. They picked it in, where are we? Pandemics. 2008, they got it right, but it wasn't on their radar. So even when they do these exercises, and this goes to Vaughan's point, we can't quantify these things. This gives us a false sense of certainty, but actually the world is an inherently uncertain place. And the big challenge, and this is just for those who are interested, this is kind of the most recent one that's out. Interestingly, in 10 years, it's all about the climate, but right now we're dealing with everything else. We're dealing with war, we're dealing with polarization, we're dealing with inequality. you can tell from the colors just how many different types of crises that we are dealing with. And so the question then becomes, how do you plan what your next move is when all of this is happening at the same time? Right? You can't say, I tell you what, we'll come back to AI when we've finished climate change, right? Or other way around. We'll get to climate change once we've dealt with social polarization. This is the context within which we are operating in. And it's like a washing machine. Yeah? That's Adam Tooze who popularized the term, but this is what it feels like, right? Everything everywhere all at once. So the question then becomes, how do you design policy for that? How do you design what the next thing is when the whole context you're operating in is shifting? Right? How can we respond to this? So some thoughts from me. Does anyone know what this building? Probably not. Vaughan, do you know what this is? No? Okay. It's Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. Hands up who's heard of Kodak. This is like the generation game. Okay, boomers, you know Kodak. Everyone else, no idea. Right, Kodak, back in the 80s, had a 96% share of all the film consumed in the world. Back in the days when cameras used to put film in them and you used to take them to get your films developed, these were the guys. What happened? Well, the world shifted and Kodak didn't. And this is a classic MBA story of businesses that don't keep up with a changing context. But what's really interesting about this, well, there's a couple of things interesting about this. Kodak also invented the digital camera. And they chose not to pursue it because they were worried that it might affect their film business, which they were right. Unfortunately, the rest of the world didn't stop. And so it did affect their business. And then smartphones came along. So what's the lesson here for public innovators? Well, when the world changes, we need to actually change our understanding about what's actually going on. And this is a framework we use quite a lot when we teach, which is, and it's a bit like Donald Rumsfeld's, what are the things you actually, what do we know? What do we actually know about anything? Do we actually know it for sure? Have we got validated knowledge? And we got evidence to back that up? What is it that we think we know, but we're not quite sure and we might need to go and test that? And those are our assumptions. And what is it that we don't know? And we actually have to go out and do research to try and close those knowledge gaps. Often, public policy falls down because we get these categories wrong. We assume we know things when actually they're assumptions, and our assumptions have probably got lots of gaps in them. So the question we have to ask ourselves in the washing machine of the poly crisis is, what do we actually know, and is it still true? Because, once upon a time, Kodak knew what the world was going to be until it wasn't. So what do we know, and is it still true? And if it's not true, how do we find out what the new truth is? And what are our mechanisms for doing that? We've done this in public policy before. This is a great quote from Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression in America, who basically said, I'll let you read it, but effectively he said, if we don't know, we've got to try stuff. If it works, if it doesn't work, admit it, great, try something else. But above all, just try something. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt led to the New Deal. We needed to invent a new school of economics, Keynesianism, to actually justify why the state did what they did. But effectively, that was the way we got ourselves out of the Great Depression, was to experiment our way out. COVID was another time when the playbook was thrown out of the window and we had to experiment. And Vaughan's touched on this morning, so I won't over-egg this. But again, we didn't have a playbook for how to deal with a pandemic. Even Singapore, that had a playbook for the pandemic, had a playbook for SARS, and SARS was not COVID, as they found out a few months in. Other countries, like Australia, like the UK, I'm not sure what it was like in Chile, they had decommissioned their pandemic planning some years prior. In the UK, they're all busy on Brexit to do pandemic planning. Literally, the people who did the pandemic planning had been reassigned to deal with Brexit. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of multiple crises. But what's really interesting is, Vaughan made the point, innovation needs uncertainty. And COVID gave us a lot of uncertainty. And in those moments, actually the policy options that were available to us were far broader than we had ever been, privy to before. We could ask different things of companies, of citizens, that we could never do before. And some of you may have seen this diagram before. This is the Overton window. It's a combination of two things, the Overton window and the futures cone. Futures cone basically tells you what's the whole universe of things you might try. The Overton window tells you this is what the public will accept. The window opened. We asked people to stay home, and they did, by and large. If you said 5 years before COVID, we're going to tell people to stay home and not go to work, and they will. That wouldn't have been perceived as a sensible policy option. In fact, if you put that to the minister, they probably wouldn't have invited you back to give another briefing. So in these moments, more options become available. And that's great news for a public innovator, because that's where we get to work. We had a shared goal during COVID, which was keep each other safe until the vaccine came along, right? And some of you may have seen this slide. Basically, how do we just try and stop the spread of this until such time as we can sort of inoculate everyone? I saw this graph and this slide, and it went viral back in March 2020. And it reminded me of another graph that I'd seen about another sort of curve that we were trying to flatten, which is around climate change. And it got me thinking about, well, what is it that we can learn from COVID that we might be able to apply to climate change? And so we did a project with Climate Kick, which is a European sort of knowledge and innovation organization, focus on how to mobilize systemic change around climate change. And we asked ourselves the question, what can we learn? What's the learning curve here? What can we learn from COVID that we can apply to climate change? And there's a whole bunch of things. We saw internal shifts around governments being more agile and digital and experimentation, all the stuff you've heard, but in COVID put a rocket under it. We saw shifts in governance. Who basically listen? Did you have daily briefings from your heads of government about how COVID was going? And we were all looking at that chart that showed all the numbers of cases around the world. I spoke to the people who built that map, and their servers melted down. They actually built it just on a weekend, on a whim. They didn't know it was going to be the #1 website in the world. Because we suddenly got interested in data. And politicians had to get good at communicating data to the public, because that's what was needed in order for them to believe that the choices they were making about how they lived and worked were important. Trust became a key metric for government's ability to pursue their agenda. And then we saw a whole bunch of new policy shifts around new social contracts. We could ask people to do different things. Sorry, I just keep feeling like I'm standing in front of people. Maybe I'll come over here for a bit. We had different conversations about public finance and how we deploy that. Now I can't actually see how much time I've got left. We started to really have a different conversation about caring for your neighbours, caring for your community, really localising that support. It wasn't the government's role solely to look after people. We all had to sort of pitch in. So thinking about how we can learn across crises becomes really important. So what advice could I give to leaders that are trying to help their organisations to basically get ready for this washing machine that is the poly crisis? This is a diagram we pulled together years ago to try and, again, sort of make sense of all the different ways of talking and thinking about innovation. We bundled it under this title of what we called Innovation Craft, because we think you kind of need all of these to kind of have the capabilities to do this kind of work. I mean, if we start at the top left, there needs to be a clear understanding and articulation of what are the core mindsets and habits of government innovation practice. So how do we become more anticipatory? How do we become more experimental? How do we become more participatory? How do we take people along on that journey? All the things I showed you on that competency framework. How do we understand those principles and live those principles every day in our work? The methods, I think, is a little bit more self-evident. How do we build capabilities to use certain methods and approaches so that we can experiment new ways of working? And do we need to embed these into our institutions? It could be a lab. It could be a new profession of service design. I'm not sure where it's at in Chile, but in the UK now, there's something like 500 service designers across the UK government. And so thinking about how do you embed this so that it becomes the new normal and not just the job for the labs and the skunk works, but anyone can do this. And in my last 54 seconds, I'm going to solve AI. No. Look, AI is a particularly interesting and unique challenge because simultaneously, it's a change in the world that as policymakers we govern, and Vaughan talked about this morning. It's potentially a change in the organizations that we govern from. So we have new sort of potential capabilities that we didn't have before. And importantly for the innovation practitioners, it's also a change potentially in our problem-solving capabilities. We can use AI as part of the mix of experimentation. We can design and prototype websites that might have taken weeks and months, and we can do it, in a couple of days or maybe even an afternoon. You may not want to vibe code your new tax system, but you might be able to play around with concepts and get them to a sort of a proof of concept a bit more sooner than we could before AI. And so AI is both an internal and an external and a capability shift. And so Vaughan talked about uncertainty this morning. And I just wanted to show you this graph. It's one of my favorite graphs. This was actually published by the Federal Reserve in the US, the Dallas their research department, and it was published in the Financial Times in the UK. And this is basically what AI is going to do to economic growth. And I don't know if I've got a laser on here. Have we got a good pointer? Okay, so we've got 3 scenarios. Either the singularity happens and we're all instantly rich. Skynet happens and it's the end of the world, or plus or minus 2% on what we did last year, right? So either AI is going to basically make everything wonderful, or we're all going to die, or it's going to be give or take what happened last year plus 2%. Apart from being the most useless graph ever published, I think it actually speaks to the kind of the uncertainty squared that is happening right now. And again, if you're a public innovator, that gives us a huge, huge opportunity to find new ways of creating public value, because anything's possible until it's not. So my encouragement to you is not to be scared by AI, but also to be a little skeptical. Don't believe all of the press and the hype, but have a play. I told you before I wanted you to remember the term accelerated learning, because that is the space we're in now. In a world of contiguous crises, all we can do is learn, and learn fast. And I wanted to leave you with this quote from Eric Hoffer. He says, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." So as we contemplate the communities and the societies that we're building public services for and policies for, above all, learn fast, test, and I wish you all the best, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for that, Brenton. I'm a learning fan, so it's so interesting to see the perspectives and how things can also not necessarily compete, but rather complement each other. You have, system thinkers and design thinkers and future thinkers, and what we see in reality is that it's all sort of connected and needs to be done integrally. I have a couple of questions from the audience. So, we'll set up the language. Yeah, that's okay? Okay. So, The first question is, ¿qué estrategias recomendarías para lograr que los distintos liderazgos y actores claves de un sistema colaboren y generen las condiciones necesarias para implementar una innovación? So this is something we talked about a little bit outside. So how you get, the decision makers to change their sort of view and allow all of this to happen.
Look, it's a good question. And I mean, my starting point is to create shared experiences and shared analyses. So what we did with the strategic foresight work in South Australia was to provide the same evidence base within which to start the conversation. Beyond that, and I've heard so many people speak today, I forgot who said it, but I can't remember who it was. Vaughan's example from the UNDP about actually getting people to be clear about what they needed to get out of a process and what they were prepared to give up to achieve it. Because I think that's really important to sort of, a lot of that stuff stays hidden. And so there's a whole other conversation about how you can create the space for psychological safety at all levels. Because innovation is inherently uncertain. So creating safety in your team to try things is important. Creating safety within leaders to have a conversation about what the real problems are and the sort of different interests that they have so they can find common ground becomes really important.
There's, you have, I'm going to say this in Spanish, and I think it's a phrase that you can take away with this because in Chile, I'm not Chilean, but in Chile they have a fantastic expression which is called hacerse los lesos, no? And people like hacerse los lesos is like, yeah, okay. But it's like we like to hide. We like to say, no, this is not going to cost anyone anything. This is going to be simple. It's going to be quick, because we think it allows people to get on board. And in reality, it only hinders the process in the long term.
Yeah, and I think for me, and we mentioned it in the competency framework about that political and bureaucratic awareness, like understanding that and navigating that, it becomes really important. So one of the things that a lot of us in this space have done is learn from each other the strategies for how you don't find yourself on the wrong side of those dynamics.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Hablas del momento de la inteligencia artificial. ¿Cuál crees que es el mayor riesgo de que los gobiernos adopten inteligencia artificial demasiado rápido? ¿Y cuál es el riesgo de hacerlo demasiado lento?
Yeah. So there's so many. I think the risks of adopting AI too quickly, I think often will come. I think the risk there is adopting solutions that external vendors have designed for them and creating what we call vendor lock-in. So the idea that you've bought software from a company and now Microsoft tells you how to do public policy, for example. So I think that's one risk. It's only one risk. I think the risk of doing it too slowly is, and again, I'll give you one risk. Citizens have AI too. And one thing I think you're going to see increasingly, and we're already seeing this in different parts of the world, is citizens are now fighting back and they're using AI to respond to planning applications or to challenge decisions that have been made. And suddenly it looks like they've got a legal team of 10 because they can produce these great kind of, well-argued cases for why they should have they should get a different result. And if you're not careful, like governments could be quickly overwhelmed by all of this. So there's a great quote by Jack Welch, and he said, if the rate of change outside the organization is faster than the rate of change inside of the organization, the end is near. And I think, Kodak will go out of business, government doesn't go out of business, but if we don't deliver on the promise to citizens that they can get good services, other things happen, like they vote for demagogues or they riot, and that becomes a very costly exercise. So, it's important for us to engage in this moment responsibly, but actively. And the last thing I'd say on this, and I mentioned this last night to a few of the colleagues, think about how you can do it safely. Actually, there's a reason we have labs, you know, with people with glasses and lab coats and gloves and goggles so they don't, you know, burn their eyes out. We do this so that we can contain some of the risks of what is effectively a volatile process. And only after we're confident that we've got it kind of worked out, then we release it to the wild. Now that analogy doesn't always hold, but I think in this space, how do we create sandboxes and little kind of environments where we can test out whether the thing works before we release it out into the wild? But I'm sure there will be some mistakes that governments will make all around the world.
Fantastic. Well, there's a third and last question. And I think it's sort of very related to what you just said. And the question is, ¿cómo puede un servicio público experimentar sin poner en riesgo la confianza de la ciudadanía? Tiene que ver con el rol de la ciudadanía y cómo la experimentación no se contrapone con la confianza y el vínculo, ¿no?
Yeah. So I think this is a really important point to make about the role of experimentation, and it builds on what Vaughan said this morning. Experimentation de-risks. And so if you want to maintain the trust of citizens, you are trying to make things more likely to succeed than not. So part of the way you experiment to keep the trust of citizens is you explain the value and the role of experimentation to improve things. Not everything's going to work, but explain to people that you've got a process for managing that safely. You know, we don't want to experiment on all government services all of the time. You know, we want to be selective on how we're trying to make improvements, and we need to make sure those improvements are indeed improvements and not backward steps. I mentioned last night to some colleagues, we had a situation in Australia where they automated our social benefits. They changed the way people had to articulate whether they were eligible or not, and hundreds of thousands of people lost their benefits when they shouldn't have, and they lost their money, and they were, you know, they were very upset, and some people committed suicide. There was a class action. It cost the government like $2 billion to pay the victims of this process because there wasn't a proper process of testing the sort of legality and the appropriateness of what they had introduced. So yes, you have to be careful, but that's not an excuse not to do anything, because the status quo, doing nothing, in a world that is changing at the speed that we've just discussed, that's the risky thing. So standing still is risky. We have to move. How do we move forward safely?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Brenton. It's been incredibly interesting hearing your perspective on these topics. Muchas gracias a todos por su participación, por sus preguntas. Ha sido un agrado estar con ustedes el día de hoy. Con esto hemos terminado y damos por concluido el seminario. En la página web del Congreso, donde ustedes se inscribieron, van a estar colgadas las presentaciones, los pósters, el resumen de los pósters y las charlas del día de hoy. Muchas gracias.